Stop dreaming and start flying. That is our message for our presentation tonight. A surging demand for pilots, technological advancements, access to modern learning resources make this just an ideal time to begin your journey. And it's certainly a lot of fun to be talking about it tonight. A very warm welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining on our webinar presentation tonight, Becoming an Airline Pilot, Keys to Achieving Your Dream. My name is Eric Radke, one of your presenters and also facilitators for the evening. I lead our talented educational team at Sporty's Academy at our headquarters in Cincinnati, Ohio at the Claremont County Airport. Very happy to have joining with me tonight an airline pilot himself, Mr. Alan Wynn, who flies for a national regional air carrier and is fairly new to the airline world, and the transition from the general aviation ranks into the airline business is very fresh in Alan's mind. Very inspirational in terms of his passion for aviation and his pursuit at following his dream. So we look forward to Alan sharing some of his personal insights and responding to some questions throughout when we get towards the end of the presentation tonight. A few items of note as we get started. Do know that we are recording tonight's presentation. It will be available the following day, tomorrow, at sportys.com/webinars in our webinar archive, and also via the Sportys YouTube channel. While you're there, be sure and check back for our upcoming schedule of presentations. This entire series is sponsored by Sportys, and a big thank you to Sportys Pilot Shop. Thank you for thinking of Sportys for all of your training and pilot supply needs for sure. And as I just alluded to before, you do have the ability via the GoToWebinar software that we are using tonight to submit questions, in particular for Alan. So as the presentation moves forward and as you think of questions, feel free to submit those, and we'll queue those up for the end of our presentation. So that we can both get to know our audience just a little bit better tonight, I am going to launch a poll that you will be able to respond to via the software. And this will just help us get a feel for if you're just getting started, if maybe you're in training and prepping for an airline interview. I kind of have a thought that we might have a little bit of a mixed bag. So I'll give everyone a few more seconds to respond. All right, thank you for those who have responded. Nearly half, a little more than half, have actually begun pilot training already. So that's great info to have. What that'll allow me to do is maybe dive into a little bit more of the detail about airline transport pilot certification requirements and a few other things. Nearly a third, though, are just dreaming. So, I'll kind of caution some of that crowd as we move through the presentation to not necessarily get bogged down in a few of those details, but we'll try to balance it out to make this appeal to that broad spectrum that we have out there in the audience tonight. Thanks again to everyone for participating in the poll. So with that, as I mentioned before, the demand for professional pilots, it's never been greater. Recent data, very recent data, indicates that pilot certification changes, which are about 4 to 5 years old now, and an increased demand, of course, which is expected to continue for air travel, have had very far-reaching deep effects across the aviation industry. Flight departments are, quite frankly, experiencing a shortage of qualified pilots. Nearly 100% of regional airlines and all of the ones that we partner with at our flight school at Sporty's Academy are recruiting pilots. So that makes it an exceptional time, of course, to be considering a career in aviation. Those current market conditions, they've been influenced by a variety of factors. So those relatively new regulations that do require all airline pilots to possess an airline transport pilot certificate. In addition to that, pilots en masse are reaching the airline mandatory retirement age, which is 65. And that's the baby boomer generation. So there's a large portion of those airline pilots that are reaching that age about the same time. And the simple fact that we just haven't built a large enough pool of qualified candidates to kind of fill those seats. and again, that steady increase in pilot demand. All of those are coming together to create this perfect storm, so to speak. So to put some hard numbers behind it, which is, again, fantastic for all the aspiring pilots out there. Look at these numbers, quite astonishing. 790,000, that's the number of new civil aviation pilots needed over the next 20 years. That's according to Boeing, who publishes a very highly regarded publication, the Boeing Pilot and Technician Outlook, which kind of looks out over the next 20-year period, used widely for forecasting across the aviation industry. Now, for some perspective, the entire U.S. pilot population is only about 600,000. And those that have reached the professional level in the U.S. only number about 200,000. And we're talking about nearly 800,000 new pilots being required. What has that done? Basic economics. It's driven up pay. It's driven up competition. So in this data that you're looking at here is a little bit old, about a year old, but about $60,000 annually is what we're seeing right now, average first-year salary. And that's the majority of regional air carriers. And consider that number somewhat fluid because, again, with competition on the rise, demand way up high, supply relatively low, that's changing on a regular basis as people get creative at how to attract pilots. So as a result, we've seen starting pay at the regional airlines on the rise sharply, along with new creative total compensation packages. In the airline industry, seniority is supreme and determines everything from pay to aircraft assignments to quality of life. The opportunity exists because of this to land those destination, those ultimate jobs much earlier in your career than had previously been possible. And that would simply just maximize not only your career earning potential, but have you in a position where you're enjoying those quality of life items much earlier in your career. Modern technology is very commonplace in training aircraft. So this speaks to the great opportunity to get started right now. You'll likely have access to digital instrumentation, electronic flight displays, moving maps, onboard weather, autopilot systems, advanced navigation equipment, a lot of equipment that's really going to serve you well in that airline career, but is really going to make for an enjoyable learning experience as well. The transformative capabilities, they're making flying more fun. They're making it accessible. They're allowing pilots to build safety systems on reliable information at a level we just haven't seen at this end of the market. And those advanced training resources out there are allowing pilots to train more efficiently and consistently, allowing training content to be accessed in mobile formats and online. Worth mentioning that Sporty's is right there in that space with an ideal flight training system that can be accessed through a variety of venues and media to assist with your ground school, your flight school, and of course your written test prep. It's certainly a system that speaks very well to that modern consumer. Let's transition, if we can, to pilot qualifications, educational requirements for that professional pilot world. First and foremost, and those who have gotten started already, you certainly understand this. While it's not a certification, that first major milestone in aviation for everyone is going to be that first solo. I mention it because no matter where you're at in this journey, whether you've set out to be a casual recreational flyer, business flyer, corporate pilot, airline pilot, or any pilot for that matter, everyone has to solo. So the message from me being, there's no need to get bogged down in too much of the details in order to get started, or even focused on all those other certifications. Focus on that first milestone is my advice, first solo, and then take it one step at a time. In terms of certifications, private pilot, a lot of people know that term. Typically the gateway certification, the first pilot certification you'll encounter if you're an aspiring professional, allowing you to fly small aircraft on good weather days. The instrument rating, which can be added to the private pilot, will carry over to your commercial pilot. And from a skills perspective, really provides the backbone of the type of operations you'll be conducting in the professional world. Allows you to operate and fly the aircraft solely by reference to flight instruments. Commercial pilot will come typically after instrument rating in most training programs, and that's the baseline certification that allows you to get paid for your flying. And then certified flight instructor. Not necessarily a requirement, but it is the most common next phase for civilian trained pilots in their career after obtaining the commercial. With minimal experience, you're typically welcomed into the teaching ranks. Most will choose to earn this teaching certification and enter the educational field to continue building experience while also earning a respectable wage and having a lot of fun doing it. So, I can't emphasize enough, the instructional experience is very attractive in the professional aviation world. It does several things for you. It demonstrates a higher level of understanding and knowledge, demonstrates your ability to function within a crew environment and make command decisions, and it's extremely satisfying to share your love, your passion with other pilots. You really have the opportunity to not only be an inspiration, but also to set examples that will really live on for future pilot generations. And then finally comes airline transport pilot, the highest level of pilot certification. And the number one requirement to get there is going to be total experience, which we're going to talk about more in the coming slides. Transitioning to the professional world, again, as a baseline to be paid for your flying, you do have to possess at least a commercial pilot certificate. And to fly for an airline, you have to possess the airline transport pilot certificate. By law, that is, you have to possess the ATP, or airline transport pilot certificate. Now, a caveat to that, there's an option to obtain a restricted airline transport pilot certificate if you're graduating from an approved college or university, or if you're a military pilot. And those experience requirements, those minimum experience requirements, will generally suffice for most regional air carriers. And don't be scared away. This is maybe getting a little ahead of myself. But for those of you who are in the pilot training journey and you're getting close to considering maybe application or evaluating these regionals, don't be scared away if you don't meet minimum experience requirements for ATP. If you've completed some of the basics, if you have a reasonable expectation that you'll be meeting minimum experience requirements in the near future, many of the regional carriers will provide ATP-CTP training, which is now a prerequisite, and assist in terms of obtaining the full ATP and getting you onboarded as part of your type rating training. Education. It is certainly, and we would still recommend that you be planning for higher education, at least at the 4-year bachelor's degree level. Although given the current market conditions of high demand, relatively low supply, most regional air carriers have dropped the requirement for pilots to possess a college degree. However, the legacy airline carriers have not. And the regional air carriers will still lean more favorably for those with that advanced education. And completing this level of education will no doubt provide additional opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be available. Now, your first step is to prepare academically as you're thinking about those college requirements. Outline your goals, determine what values, benefits, rewards are important to you, and do the research to determine the training and educational skill requirements for the job you want in aviation. And kudos for you to being on tonight, because that's part of what we are exploring. And finally, you'll need to establish priorities that will move you closer to those goals. And part of that will be determining a plan for getting through that training, and that comes with an investment. So, one of those obstacles that I personally routinely see are people that start on this journey but maybe don't have a sound or thorough academic plan for making the investment and having it fully funded. And I can say that a break in continuity, or a lack of continuity, that can come with these pauses in training when it comes to financing not being in place, those can really be momentum killers, no doubt about it. Life of an airline pilot. Let's focus on the life of an airline pilot right now, because it's important to understand what work life is like so that you will be prepared and that your support network will be prepared. Heavily seniority based. When you get hired at an airline and your seniority number dictates a variety of elements related to pay, quality of life, aircraft selections, pilot base, when you are eligible to upgrade to captain. Compensation, we referenced it early on. Right now, we're seeing these starting salaries in the $60,000 a year annually in the current market, and it will steadily go up from there. Captains can expect to earn six figures, and at the majors, at the legacy air carriers, the household names that we all know, Delta, United, American, UPS, FedEx, Southwest, after a year of probationary pay, as it's known, you can expect to earn into the six figures, and as much for more senior captains, upwards of $300,000 annually, with a host of benefits, including travel. Schedules are created monthly, again heavily seniority based. You typically submit or bid for a specific sequence of trips. They're referred to as lines. Pilot training is exceptional. It's extensive. You become an expert on operations, on safety procedures and protocols. Some of the reason why airline travel is as safe as it's been, safer than anyone ever imagined. But one thing to note, it is not a typical Monday through Friday 9 to 5 job, and I'm sure that's what attracts many of you to the profession. But airline flying, especially early on in your career, it doesn't discriminate against early mornings, against evenings or nights or weekends or holidays. Especially early on in your career. So, the point being, you simply have to be prepared for those requirements. Let's focus in a little bit, some more detail on ATP requirements in particular. As I've mentioned, the airline transport pilot certification is required by law for all airline pilots. First officers, domestic, flag, supplemental operations, they have to hold the ATP, and they have to have an airplane type rating for the aircraft to be flown. So that's a specialty training course that on your license essentially describes you and creates and builds you as an expert on that particular airframe. Captains are required to have a full ATP and at least 1,000 hours in airline operations. And you also have to have those basics that you're probably accustomed to if you're already in the process. If not, English proficiency, of course, is a requirement. There's a stipulation that you have to be a person of good moral character. And then you have to have an existing certification that you can add an ATP onto. And then the requisite experience that's outlined in the regulations, and of course, a written examination and also a practical exam. Now that 1,500 hours, that probably jumped out to a lot of you. That's a number that's pretty widely known, so hopefully it's not a shock. You have to have for the unrestricted ATP the 1,500 hour total flying experience. And we don't need to go into specific detail about each of these elements that's on the screen. You can read through those, and these are available in the regulations. These are published everywhere. You can look those up. But one item on here I want to highlight specifically, and that relates to the 500 hours of cross-country time. And I highlight that because that tends to be the element as you go through that list that oftentimes holds individuals back. And that stems from the fact that I describe the most popular pathway for civilian trained pilots as being in the teaching or the flight instructor ranks. And oftentimes you're just not in scenarios when you're in the training ranks where you're going to be building or logging a whole lot of cross-country time. So that can be an area to pay attention to. Now, multi-engine airline transport pilot, and this was relatively new and part of those regulatory changes in the last 5 years. It does require 50 hours of multi-engine time. So that's another highlight I want to make, and something everyone needs to kind of keep an eye on as you're filling out your logbook and you're acquiring this experience over a multi-year time frame. And to take the knowledge test for multi-engine ATP, you also must have taken and completed and received a graduation certificate from an FAA-approved ATP Certification Training Program. Acronym we use is ATP-CTP in the industry. Now I'm going to talk a little more about the specifics of ATP-CTP in the coming slides. So ATP-CTP, brand new requirement. It's a prereq, as I just described, to taking the written test for ATP. So it was another step, it was another level of training that was implemented, that was deployed in order to give our kind of incoming ATP recipients some early training in large aircraft and airline specific operations. So here is the quick nuts and bolts of what ATP-CTP is all about. It does have to be FAA approved, so it does, for an institution that's delivering this, they do have to create a training course outline, submit it for approval, follow all these guidelines that are outlined in the advisory circular. It requires a minimum of 30 hours of classroom ground-based training. It also requires 10 hours of simulator training, and 6 out of those 10 hours have to be in a full flight simulator. So this is a full motion, large, hydraulically controlled simulator device that you typically find at airline type training schools. The part of the regulations where these schools are certified is known as Part 142. And the simulator itself has to be representative of an aircraft with a max takeoff weight of 40,000 pounds or greater. So again, this is all to give the student, the pilot, that heavier jet experience going into it. This type of subjects that will be covered range anywhere from aerodynamics, high altitude operations, stall prevention, meteorology, air carrier operations in general. Fitness for duty, communications, checklist, philosophy, everything that you might expect that you're going to experience. Now there is its individual written exam component that's part of ATP-CTP, but rest assured, if you're taking this type of course, and if you're on an airline track, again, it's worth repeating what I had said earlier in the presentation. This is typically employer sponsored. You're going to get all this information ahead of time, and this is not typically an element or a course where you have to spend hours or days or weeks prepping ahead of time. ATP knowledge exam. An important note following ATP-CTP, and I'll mention that this does tend to be a source of confusion for a lot of pilots. That course itself, even though it's a prerequisite for the written exam, it does not prepare you for the written exam. It's not directly connected in any way to the written exam. A lot of pilots kind of confuse that. They go into ATP-CTP thinking, well, I need this to take the written exam, so therefore when I get out of my 30-hour ground school, they will have taught me everything I need to know, and that is not the case at all. You would want to prepare and want to engage maybe another type of training provider for that written exam content and preparation. ATP knowledge exam results. I mention it because this is different from most written exams you will take through your aviation career. They're good for 5 years or 60 calendar months. The norm is 24 months or 2 years. And also of note, a single engine ATP, this does not apply to. We're talking multi-engine ATP here. Now, those on a professional career, that's the overwhelming majority of you are going to have to obtain the multi-engine ATP. Now, in your mind, if you're thinking, well, a workaround to ATP-CTP would be go get my single engine ATP and do multi-engine later. Well, the prerequisite requirement still stands for ATP-CTP because there are individual written exams you have to take. So there's no workaround. If you want to eventually have a multi-engine ATP, you will have to take the ATP-CTP class, but again, for most, that's just going to be rolled right into all of your kind of initial airline training. Let's talk restricted ATP for a second, a relatively new term for us in aviation. And it came about back in 2014 when all of these new ATP requirements went into effect for airline pilots to possess that cert in order to be permitted to fly. When the FAA introduced this new requirement, they also introduced a level of ATP called restricted ATP, which allows you to do some operations in the air carrier world without having reached that full 1,500 hours of flight experience. So who might be eligible for the restricted ATP? Well, if you're less than 1,500 hours total time, if you come from a military background, if you're a military pilot, you may be eligible to obtain your restricted ATP at only 750 hours of total flying experience. If you've graduated in an aviation program that's approved with an aviation major, you may be eligible at 1,000 hours of total flying experience. And if you've graduated from a program that confers an associate degree associated with an aviation major, you may be eligible at 1,250 hours of total time. So this is essentially the FAA recognizing that with a structured, approved curriculum delivered in this collegiate aviation environment or via the military, that credit essentially will be given, would allow you to obtain the restricted ATP and fly as a first officer in airline operations. Now, the program that you are in, it has to be approved. It has to be granted the authority and authorization from FAA to be able to authorize or qualify for that restricted ATP. Now, there's another set of pilots that's also eligible for restricted ATP, even if you do not come from one of those approved programs. And it's available, as you may remember, unrestricted ATP required you to be 23 years of age. So at 21 years of age, you can now be eligible for restricted ATP. Restricted ATP also requires only 200 hours of cross-country. So I call this the kind of CFI element to this regulation right here. So remember when I referenced earlier how daunting building up that 500 hours of total cross-country experience. Well, the FAA has allowed for that. And they've described within these restricted ATP requirements that you can be eligible with only 200 hours of cross-country time if the other hour requirements have been met. And then it allows you, as I mentioned, to fly as a first officer, a second in command. You can't be a captain, but you can be a first officer. And in the check ride you will accomplish as part of it is the full ATP check ride. And then once you meet those full experience requirements of ATP, no need to take another check ride. You can simply document that and notify the FAA that you've reached those requirements, and it's just a matter of some additional paperwork in order to get the full unrestricted issued. Let's move on to the airline interview process. And I'm excited, just like you, to get a little firsthand knowledge from Alan on this, but we're going to talk about some very basics of the airline interview process, starting with some key success driver. Number one, and what I will say, this has worldly application, even if you're not necessarily on an airline track, but you're looking to get a part-time job doing whatever. A lot of these principles will apply. Number one, do your homework. It is not good practice to simply blanket the industry or the entire world with generically worded cover letters, resumes, with little regard to who the company actually is or what they're looking for. That's not to say you shouldn't be your own best advocate and work to convince a potential employer of your qualifications, even if you fall short in some categories. But being woefully short in multiple categories, that could be seen as a bit of a waste of time and a waste of energy. So you want to know that you're at least close. So in other words, do some research on those qualifications. Now, while educational requirements, they kind of move around, they go up and down with supply and demand. As I mentioned earlier, most regional air carriers, even though they're still not publishing it right now, but they will certainly prefer some higher education, associate degree, even better, a 4-year baccalaureate degree. And you'll want to have in hand a valid first-class medical certificate, current passport, all of those documents. I'll talk a little bit more about the documents a little more. Do your research. Be informed about any organization in the head of an interview. It does a couple things. It ensures it's a company you really want to work for or fly for. It will allow you to make a good first impression, knowing some of that information in the background. Specific to airlines, before you go into an interview, you want to know where the pilot bases are, type of equipment. You should be able to find, you can readily find online pay scales, typical time to upgrade, and do your best to find the little out about culture. If you have friends that you've developed in a network that you can reach out to, even better. There's numerous online tools to assist in the research. General searches, there's some sites that specialize in this type of information. And tap in again to that insight of other pilots you may know, or if you have a friend of a friend, make that connection. Use LinkedIn, use other social media outlets. They can be a good source of who you can contact to get some firsthand knowledge. And don't get lulled into a false sense of security by grabbing onto the first Google return if you are doing some homework in this. Go to the company website, read the about sections, familiarize yourself with the history, the executives, anything that may stand out in an annual report. Consider what's important from the company's perspective. Look at recent media releases, news stories, anything like that that's current. The ability for you to make a personal connection with someone you've discovered is a great opportunity to make a good, lasting impression, and that is just such a key element to landing your dream job. One of the most sought-after traits for employer is an engaged employee. There's studies that have been done related to this, and if your research doesn't quite lead you in the direction you would like, not all is lost. Use this as an opportunity to ask questions of the interviewer. Almost all interviewers will leave some time for you to ask some questions. Other success drivers. Organize your documents. The application process is going to force you to have your documents, pilot certification, logbook, medical, photo ID, passport, transcripts, organized for submission. But don't forget about the in-person piece. It's always a good idea to have a single folder with copies of everything I just mentioned. You may never know when you might be required or when you might be asked for something else, and that includes references, professional references. It's a good idea to identify at least 3 professional references and have those contacts listed on a standalone document that you can hand over in the event you are asked about references. And now, at the risk of stating the obvious, because I've had this happen to me, select those who you believe will, of course, make the strongest recommendation on your behalf. Think about former coworkers, supervisors, those who can attest to your piloting ability, those who can speak firsthand to your skills, your work ethic, your commitment, your adherence to safety practices, policies, procedure. And also consider different categories of references. Don't stack your reference list with just pilots. A contact outside of aviation that can speak to your professionalism, your dependability, that'll demonstrate you have some dimension, you're multidimensional, you're multi-talented. And a final word on references, be sure to gain permission first. Again, this has also happened to me where I've been called and asked about a reference and I really didn't know anything about it. That can be an awkward situation. It can be a bit embarrassing, and it's generally pretty obvious when you're caught off guard. So make sure that person that you're using in a reference knows that you are putting them down and they give you permission and you give them some awareness. And This will also give you the opportunity to, plant some seeds and kind of let them know in a soft way what you would like them to say, what you're expecting them to say. And it's just the courteous, right thing to do, for sure. Preparing for your interview, ensure your currency. Make sure your medical is up to date. I mentioned first class medical. Make sure you're current from a legal perspective. Check and double check your logbook. Are you instrument current? Do you have a current flight review that's logged? Are you passenger current regarding your landings? In other words, is your logbook up to date? Interviewers are going to see not necessarily a perfectly neat and tidy logbook, but it certainly should be easy to follow. Some interviewers will ask that will want to see your logbook, that you can identify various milestones, that you can point and trace back when you earned a private certification or when you soloed, when you became a CFI. It's good to have those type of milestones in your logbook ready to identify. I get a lot of questions this day and age about digital logbooks or electronic logbooks and whether that's acceptable, and the answer is absolutely yes. It's not a necessity, but digital logbooks are becoming more and more commonplace, so that's absolutely perfectly acceptable. Now, with a digital logbook, you might want to consider a printout, because again, still a lot of employers will want to kind of see some hard copies, especially when it comes to identifying those type of milestones. Be diligent in your research and organization. And none of that will matter unless you're rehearsed at delivering the information. So there's a lot of great resources online that will provide sample interview questions. It's not cheating to prepare answers in advance or think about responses. In fact, it's the smart thing to do. Consider mock interviews. Get someone you trust that can ask some questions and you can rehearse responding to. For example, a common question: tell us about yourself. Give us a summary about who you are. You don't want to stumble over that one. That's kind of the easy one. They tee up for you. Develop an elevator speech, so to speak, that highlights your certifications, your accomplishments, any specific experience that you think you want to highlight or stand out, something that's going to allow you to differentiate yourself. Conflict resolution is another common source of questioning. You'll want to prepare some anecdotes for quick retrieval that demonstrate you can get along with others, you can solve problems, you can rectify certain situations. The airline's entrusting you with a tremendous amount of responsibility and the safety of hundreds, reputation. They want to be confident in your ability to utilize information and make sound, well-informed decisions. And if you're having trouble with clear examples that demonstrate, some attribute, talk to others about ideas. Again, this isn't cheating. This is just good, diligent homework. It's likely that others have experiences that may jog your memory. And maybe a similar situation can be modified to fit a similar circumstance that happened to you. So certainly be open in talking to others. And while I've talked about being well rehearsed, it's a little bit of a balancing act, because you certainly don't want to sound robotic. You want to be likable. You want to appear open and warm and welcoming. Your voice needs to be confident, warm, with inflection. If you need to record yourself, record yourself. Body language, very important, should project confidence. It should project honesty, positive energy. People respond to emotional connections, not robotic memorized scripts. Dress, very important. Details matter in aviation. Impressions, it's human nature. They're going to be formulated from the time you walk in the door. So let's agree that humans, we all are fairly superficial. So it's widely known, of course, and accepted that it's a good practice to dress for the job that you want in a manner that is aviation appropriate. So I would describe that as formal, conservative, crisp. For the gentleman, dark, well-fitted suit, light-colored shirt are typically your best options, and of course, anything loud or flashy that should be avoided. Each article of clothing should be clean and pressed. Trip to the dry cleaner is usually in order. Make sure your shoes fit, they're clean, they're not scuffed or scratched, colors match. Again, details matter. You're going to be examined from head to toe. That fine attention to detail will demonstrate your respect for the opportunity and your appreciation for the responsibilities of the job of professional pilot. So remember that. So with that, I'm happy to kind of bring in a new voice now to the presentation, and that is my good friend Alan Wynn, flight instructor at Sporty's Academy, an airline pilot for a large regional air carrier based in the Southwest. And Alan, thank you for being here with us tonight. I'm really anxious, as are all of our listeners, to get some of your personal insights and advice when it comes to this journey that you have been on. So to kind of introduce our attendees tonight, let's start with telling us how you got started in aviation and what drew you specifically to this airline dream that you are now pursuing.
Hey Eric, thanks for having me tonight. I'm happy to be here and share my experiences with everybody. This is a great opportunity, and I've climbed the ladder, so figured it's my turn to give back to the community. I'm very happy to do so. But to answer your question, my dad used to take me to air shows all the time as a kid, and he basically bought me anything aviation related, and from toys to video games like flight simulators, and that just kind of drew me to aviation initially. And then as I grew up, I started learning more about pilot training and stuff like that. But flying on flight simulator and trying to figure out the airliners and how to get them going was, a joy for me. And then going plane watching with my dad and watching them take off and land was also something that I did a lot. But honestly, just thinking about it, getting paid to fly a jet, hauling people around for a living sounded like a lot of fun. So I'm doing it today, and wouldn't change it for anything else.
Alan, I'm sure you would agree in something that I really enjoy about coming to the airport each and every day. Aviation tends to be, that profession where it doesn't attract people who don't just love airplanes, and aviation would probably do it for free. Is that kind of the same experience that you've seen in the airline world too, the people that you're flying with day in and day out?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to be transparent. Not everybody there loves the job completely, but for the most part, most of the peers I've worked with have been very enjoyable and share that same passion for sure.
Now, what would you describe, or what has been the most challenging element of your journey? And I'll kind of leave that open-ended, whether you want to talk about early on in training or in the airline transition, but talk about some challenging element maybe that stands out to you.
So I'll kind of jump around a little bit. I'll try not to make this too long, but in the beginning, I'd say the beginning of my flight training was just the fact that aviation was so foreign to me. You're learning all these new terms, new things, aerodynamics, systems, weather. You're basically learning you're becoming like a mini expert in all these areas that I didn't know really entailed and came with aviation until I actually did it. But as far as like overall in the aviation world, I'd say the constant challenge of keeping up with the dynamic world of aviation and getting tested on it every so often through a check ride. And for those of you in training know what I'm talking about. You're constantly studying for the next step, whether it's private pilot, instrument rating, commercial, you're always studying, and that never changes. Like when you get to the professional world, you're doing it even more often because, as Eric mentioned earlier, it's a really big responsibility to be flying people around for a living in these multi-million-dollar airplanes. So it's pretty reasonable to expect that you're going to be tested on basic fundamentals of what your airline or whatever company you're with challenges you to do. And things are always changing, whether it's FARs or company procedures, but it's our responsibility as pilots to stay up to date. And it definitely makes it a challenge though when training procedures change and policies change, especially when the company has done something for so long, because we're all creatures of habit. So totally understand there. I hate it when things change, but it's part of aviation, and you just got to go with it.
Now let's. So how about talking about the most rewarding? What are a couple highlights that kind of stand out to you? Maybe the obvious one is you just talked about getting paid to fly jets around. But the most rewarding element so far of this journey.
Um, you know, so I've had a lot of late nights as a student in college. I'm sure a lot of people can sympathize with me, working full time as a CFI while trying to study for additional ratings like my MEI and just juggling so many other things, personal life at home, and also trying to do some things for the Sporties video department on the side. Um, Honestly, just being able to wear the uniform and getting paid to fly a jet and not coming home to any office or schoolwork is pretty rewarding. But I would say the most rewarding thing that's, now that all this is finally paid off, is the fact that people are now coming to me, like in the terminals, or whether I'm, wrapping up a trip or whatever. If I'm walking through the airport, I've got plenty of people that have asked me on my layovers about advice to how I got here today, and they basically just recognize and respect the fact that I've climbed this ladder, and they too want to climb this ladder, and that's partially why I'm here today. And getting to do things like this, like being able to talk about my experience, is definitely the most rewarding thing so far.
Alan, I'm going to start taking a few questions that our participants tonight have submitted. The first question surrounds talking about your time. I told the audience, of course, that you were a flight instructor. You trained primary pilots and instrument pilots and did some multi-engine training as an instructor as well. The question really is just about, describing that experience as a CFI, and how did what you learned as a CFI, or what you did as a CFI, how did that help prepare you for the airline flying that you're doing now?
So how my CF time as a CFI prepared me for my airline flying? Well, I spent 2 years as a CFI at Sporties Academy. It was a great experience. I worked with some great people, great students and instructors, some of which are now here at this airline. And I've got to say, the rigid 141 structure, the high expectations and standards set by Sporties, are what's set good study habits for the airlines, and it prepared me for the intensity of the airline training, because really the two share the same expectations as the airlines. You should be coming to each lesson prepared. Review the material that you're asked to look at, and just stay on top of things if you can, because the training in both your primary training and the airline training, maybe not so much the primary training because you have a little bit more control over that, but more so the airline training, it moves from area to area at a relatively quick pace, and you're expected to keep up. Now, that's not to say that they don't have any flexibility. They do, but it's also a professional world of flying, so they do expect you to keep up to some degree. So you need to have those fundamental study skills, and just like Eric mentioned earlier, being connected with your peers, camaraderie really will pay off in the end. You can't make it through this industry on your own, that's for sure.
Great advice. How about, let's shift gears, another question from the audience. Tell us a little bit about that application process, and maybe some of what you went through in identifying the airline that you wanted to fly for.
Sure. So yeah, the application process, the biggest advice that I'll share with everybody that's listening tonight is the same one that I've heard. Everyone has told me to live in base, don't commute, and go for the quality of life. And that definitely resonated with me. And with the airline I'm currently at, there's 2 bases here at home. It really made no sense to go elsewhere. And most of my peers from Sporties are also now here. And honestly, as far as identifying the airlines I wanted to work for, I really just looked at the fact that this airline had a base of where I'm at, because when you really start to look at all the other airlines and kind of put them up side by side, they're more or less the same. They offer the same package, the sign-on bonuses, the referral bonuses, same pay scale, benefits, and so on and so forth. Now, if there's an airline in particular that's behind, just like Eric said, as supply and demand changes to keep up with competition, the other airlines will eventually catch up. The equipment flown at the regional level is fairly similar across the board. A lot of CRJs, ERJs, E145s. So don't get so caught up in trying to nitpick each airline. Try to find one that gives you that good quality of life. Living in base, though, is a huge, significant improvement of quality of life. So just gonna kind of throw a small scenario out there for the audience. So, you're on a 4-day trip, you've been flying 4 legs a day, you've had 10-hour days, and then on that last day, known as go home day, you're flying, you had, again, another long day, maybe delays or something. I think the last thing you want to do is get to your home base airport that's not actually your home airport, and then having to try and catch a flight, or worst case scenario, you do miss your flight, which a lot of people do if you're a late flyer. And then you have to stay in what's called a crash pad, or a place that you basically rent out with other people, or a hotel, before you can get home. And sometimes you can't even get home because it's pointless, because maybe you only have 1 day off or 2 days off, so you might as well just stay where you're at. So just something to think about.
Thanks, Alan. How about let's shift gears to the airline interview process. So could you walk us through that, what you went through, which I know is going to be very common across any of the air carriers, but walk us through what that was like when you got called for that interview, and how did that day go?
So the interview process itself was pretty laid back. Um, Leading up to the interview, I used all the resources I could, from using the Gouge. The Gouge is online, which is basically an area where people will submit their interview experience and what questions they were asked, to my peers who have already gone through this process. But I submitted my application, got the call, and then I was flown out and I was met with other applicants at the site. And just like Eric mentioned earlier, you definitely need to dress for success, because everyone else there will be too. This is a serious job, as Eric mentioned. But I met up with a couple other people, had a little chat with them, and then we all got pulled into like a classroom-like setting where they did a presentation for a couple hours about the company. And we had a chance to answer or ask questions and have them answered, and just get a more first person perspective from everybody that's already there, because these are actual pilots and stuff that are doing these interviews, not just like the marketing team or anything like that. But once that was all said and done, we were all pulled out one by one for our interview. There was a person that was doing the HR, and then there was a technical interview with a pilot with the company. The HR questions were pretty straightforward. They were just like what you mentioned earlier. They're just personality questions to kind of gauge who you are as a person. Is this somebody I want to spend 4 days with flying for 10 hours? Well, not actually 10 hours, but you're going to be spending 10-hour days with them. And then after that, you got technical questions from the pilot, using a few weather scenarios, Jeppesen approach charts. In short, there are basically some basic legality questions posed in a scenario format, walking through an approach, how it would be performed, followed by chart symbology. So nothing too difficult, just things you got to prepare for, things that you should look up ahead of time. And like Eric said, prepare for those personality type questions, have some stories and stuff that you can tell, and prove that you can, answer these questions without sounding too robotic. But as we all know, aviation is very dynamic, so this may have very well changed, because this was a year ago and supply and demand shifts so much. So,
Got it. Now, also, several attendees that are interested in hearing your firsthand account, and you'll have to abbreviate it, I'm sure, but talk to us about that new hire training process. The steps that, the standard steps that you would go through as a new hire first officer.
yeah, so the new hire training, I mean, it's all kinds of emotions. It's exciting, overwhelming, and stressful. You meet a lot of new people and you learn a lot of new things in a whole different type of flying. It's very busy though. Eric kind of went through already the ATP-CTP. It's exactly what he said it was. It's, ground school on a couple of principles. And then you do your sim training, where you learn about some basics of high altitude flying and other things that are related to flying turbojet airplanes. Meanwhile, you're studying for your written. Once that's done, you basically go to your first officer class, and you have your usual paperwork with HR, and then you learn throughout a couple of weeks, everything on aircraft limitations and systems, company manuals, the company system, like pay, bidding, benefits, scheduling, how all that works, trying on your uniform, and then also the bigger stuff like the procedures training and then the sim training. It was a long 4 months, but it's been quite the experience. But yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
And would you, there's several questions, and I have some maybe opinions on this too, but we've had several, individuals that are on that are in some existing career and they're considering making a change, and some might be a little bit later in life. So the question really is about what type of advice, or is it realistic? And Alan, I'll let you respond as well, but firstly, I would like to say absolutely. If you're in an existing profession, if you're in a job and it's not something you love to do, and this is always, aviation is always been a bit of a calling for you, it's always been in the background, it absolutely is not too late to do that. I've certainly know that pilots are being hired into their 50s at some of the regional air carriers. Certainly 30s, 40s, absolutely frequently, that is commonplace. If you're in that type of situation, and especially if you already possess a college degree, my advice would be find a training academy that specializes in accelerated training. That is condensing like commercial pilot training into a year or less, because certainly time is of the essence in making a transition, and you don't want to be in a situation, if you're in an existing career, where you're going some prolonged period of time without steady income. So, researching an academy that can deliver that part of training where you have some reasonable expectation of success, an academy that has industry relationships, where they are known to many of the airlines that hire pilots. That's always a key element to that. But, my quick answer to that is no, it's absolutely not too late to be thinking about this. There's a couple things, certainly being well researched and identifying the academy that you wish to kind of pursue, that is definitely key. And then also having a sound financial plan in place, so there's continuity in your training. Continuity, I mentioned it earlier, it's a momentum killer. If you have to take breaks, it always takes longer in the end. Alan, do you have anything to add in terms of the people that are asking, hey, I'm 35 or I'm 45, I'm in a career, I'm in a profession, is it too late for me? What should I do?
I think you hit all the points on the head, but yeah, I'll definitely add to that for everyone that's asking, if it's too late. Definitely not, for sure. It's a great time to get into the industry, and I've flown with all kinds of people who are ages, from 23 to, 35 and above, at all kinds of different experience levels. It's definitely not too late to career change. In fact, I just talked to somebody who is, 37 who is thinking about a career change, and it's definitely not too late, but it's something that you do have to plan for, as it is a big financial leap, if you will. But as Eric mentioned, making this career change and jumping ship, so to speak, will require a lot of preparation and a lot of planning. And one of those accelerated flight schools is definitely one of the ways to do it. You can get your pilot license. I got from 0 to CFI in about 2.5 years, but a lot of the slowdowns for me was weather. So if you're flying in a good weather spot, it's definitely possible to achieve all your ratings required to start getting paid and start building hours in a much smaller time frame. And that's, even at 2 years, that's still nothing in the grand scheme of how much you could be flying at the airlines for another, 20, 30 years or so.
Alan, what a lot of people are interested in what lies ahead for you. Or what are your plans, or what are your goals in terms of where you're at now, where you'd like to be in several years?
So I'd definitely like to continue my endeavors at my current airline. I enjoy it. The job is fun. It definitely has its days, but it's pretty much what I expected it to be. Hopefully upgrading to captain in the near future. But I would like to I'm not the kind of person that likes to do just one thing. I would like to become maybe a line check airman, or an instructor of some sort in the future in the 121 world. but I definitely like working where I am now. I'm still part-time in the video department here at Sporties as a part-time gig. It's been a great opportunity that I've been grateful for because, now I get to work in not just like other things I'm passionate about, like photography and video, but I also get to stay current in the GA world where, many professional pilots seem to forget about the GA world once they move on. But I like to kind of dabble in a little bit of everything. So, but ultimately, I'd like to get to a major carrier of some kind and just basically continue my 121 career with, GA on the side.
Alan, thank you very much. With that, we are just about out of time. In closing, I would just like to offer, for those who responded in the poll that are out there dreaming, a couple of key pieces of advice. Talk to as many people in aviation, as many pilots as you can find. Do your homework in terms of identifying a flight school, a flight academy that you can entrust to deliver this training, that where you go and you feel comfortable and you have a reasonable expectation of success. If you're not a regular reader or subscriber of Student Pilot News and you're just getting started, that's a free online periodical produced by Sporties. A lot of great resources there to help you identify a flight school, to help you evaluate a good flight instructor, some video-based resources, and an ongoing flight training blog that I think you will find will just be inspirational, uplifting, help you understand that you're not in this alone. There's a lot of people going through the very same things that you are. For those of you who responded and are in some form of training, our best wishes to you. Keep up the great work. Always be setting goals. Always be adjusting those goals. Own your training process. Be in charge. Be the captain of your vessel. If you hit a learning plateau, if you have a cancellation because of a mechanical or weather, make sure you're leading the charge to get that made up. Make up that ground. Keep pushing yourself. Do as much as you can do to keep yourself prepared and keep learning. That's a cornerstone mark and a key element of what will be your professional obligation, which is to keep learning, keep getting better. Quick reminder, we did record the entire presentation tonight, so if you wanted to come back to one of the slides or an important point, you can do so tomorrow. Check back at sporties.com/webinars, or also check for it, follow Sporties on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You'll see the posting there as well. And if you're coming back to the archive, be sure and sign up for a future presentation. That will be a very short, several question survey at the end to give us a little feedback and maybe some ideas for a future presentation. For Alan Wynn, my name is Eric Radke again. We certainly appreciate you joining us. And again, best wishes for all of your future aviation endeavors. Have a great night.